thing that stands out for me most is that there is this, despite this very serious poverty that is there, that is present to you, that makes its presence felt, that is not hidden. Poverty is not hidden in the way that we hide poverty in countries like Australia. It's that there is this richness of joy apparent in many of the people that we met from that place. Now that goes for our new friends from India, but it also goes for our new friends from across Asia, who had this shared commitment to moral theology in some way or other. People who, for all sorts of very real challenges, very real and sometimes very urgent problems, crises at some points, there was this sharing of joy. Joy that this event was happening, that this was an opportunity to forge friendships, to network, to work together and to think together, but also joy, the joy of visiting this quite beautiful and rich culture in many respects, and the joy of sharing that and learning from that. That's what stands out. So I keep thinking of, Dan, your reference to the smile that greeted you when you get to the airport. I can think of a whole number of smiles that happened during the conference. Occasionally, those would be smiles even in disagreement, where we're sitting there and we're working through issues, or we're talking through some of the challenges that we might each face in our own countries in different contexts for the church. We might disagree on certain elements of how we approach the problem, or how we even gauge what the problem is. But nevertheless, there was this comradeship, this friendship, this joy that emerged. And so those smiling faces, that sharing of that joy, because at the heart of it was not just sharing with one another across a different culture or different cultures, but just real, genuine people bringing themselves and all of their story and their vulnerabilities as well as their achievements to the table. And that was really beautiful. And the thing with India is that it's a very sensory experience. So the food is different, sometimes quite spicy. The smell of the place is there's this combination of different food being cooked out in the open, as well as the pollution of the city and the car fumes and everything else, as well as the sounds. All of that to me is a way of testifying also to that sense of joy that I found.
That's a really great observation. I certainly saw that too, and I think that point about the kind of charitable, respectful dialogue that we had at the conference was remarkable, because when you talk about moral issues, and you see this a lot in a country like Australia, like when a moral issue is on the news and people are debating about it, they're generally not charitable or respectful towards each other. So to know that sometimes there was kind of fierce disagreement in one sense between opposing positions, but as you say, it was done with a smile, and it was done always with the capacity afterwards to go and sit down and share a meal with the person you disagree with. It was just beautiful, I think. But Jim Keenan, in his who's the founder of Catholic Theological Ethics in the World Church, in his closing remarks made mention of that, how charitable the feeling was in the conference. That there was a real sense of cohesiveness in the group, even though we weren't all uniform in our approaches and even some of our conclusions. So I think that was a really good observation. The thing that stood out for me the most is just how active the discipline of moral theology is around Asia. For example, I was on a panel with an ethicist from Myanmar talking about doing Catholic theological ethics in a challenging political context, Maurice from Myanmar, and Sister Valali from India, who's India's first woman moral theologian. And that, just in a microcosm, captures some of the diversity of the people who are involved in the context, and really gives an insight into, I think, how active the discipline is too. in the Asian context. And we commented a few times in our discussions over there that Australian theologians tend to define themselves against American theologians and European theologians. And I think what stood out for me most at the conference in Bangalore is how important it is for us to begin to collaborate more closely and understand the important work that's going on in Asian moral theology as well. Because we're quite a small group in the Australian context, but having seen the liveliness and the activity that's going on in the Asian context, that's what stood out for me most in terms of the conference. And then, of course, the broader context in which you framed it there, the city of Bangalore. Like, academically, what stood out for me and personally is that many of the questions we were grappling with, questions of environmental concern, social concern, bioethical concern, you only had to walk out onto the street to see them face to face. And that was amazing how the questions of social concern weren't, in a sense, separated from the questions of bioethical concern or sexual ethics concern. It was all lumped in together there, I felt. I think we have a tendency in this context sometimes to separate those areas out. But for example, thinking of our friend James from the Philippines, who was well, still is, a medical doctor, a surgeon, and now is a moral theologian. His comment that, in countries like India, the distinction between what counts as ordinary means and extraordinary means of treatment is very different because of the resources that are available. So there you have a social concern and a bioethical concern right next to one another. And I'd never seen it face to face like that, so that stood out for me a lot.